Nosek wants to argue is that there's a relatively small correlation between people's consciously expressed attitudes towards these outgroups, if you will, and their attitudes as expressed on the implicit association test. The general idea here is that, yes, we know that the IAT is expressing unconscious attitudes, unconscious social attitudes, because the correlations are relatively low. First thing to point out is that the correlations are not, in fact, all that low. This red line is the average line from that earlier study of the correlations between implicit and explicit expressions of measurements of motives. The average was well below 0.2, but here the median correlation across all these studies summarized by Nosek is a whopping 0.48. Personality psychologists would kill for correlations that high. Okay? This is not 1.0 or even 0.8 or 0.7, so it's low in that relative sense. But in fact, by the standards of social science research, these are quite good correlations, quite high correlations. In social science research, if you get a correlation of 0.3 between a self-report and actual behavior, you're doing well. So the first thing to note here is that in fact the evidence for the dissociation is relatively weak. This median correlation is very, very, very far from zero. There are other problems with the IAT as well. One of these is that we know that this kind of procedure that Greenwald and Banaji employed based on stimulus-response compatibility is susceptible to lots of different kinds of confounding factors. For example, if the target of the judgment is relatively unfamiliar, you are going to get these kinds of issues. People tend to think that familiar things are more positive, unfamiliar things are more negative. That's an association between the familiar and the unfamiliar, not an association about blacks versus whites or Japanese versus Koreans. Another problem with the IAT is that the IAT, by virtue of the mathematics involved in the IAT, can't make a distinction between attitudes that are unfavorable towards a group and attitudes that are simply less favorable towards a group. So as a Swede, okay, person of Swedish extraction, I can say, I like Swedes better than Finns. Okay, so shoot me, right? But to say I like Swedes better than Finns is not to say I hate Finns. There's a difference there, okay? And the IAT is not sensitive to that difference. Moreover, and this I think is really the critical point, is that the IAT doesn't make a distinction between a person's knowledge of a social stereotype, or for that matter, even a person's knowledge of generalized social attitudes, and his or her personal acceptance of that stereotype or personal acceptance of that social attitude. So there are all sorts of problems with the IAT, and I go on like this precisely because the IAT is extraordinarily popular in both basic and applied research right now, and we just don't know what's going on. There's a lot of research going on with the IAT. Some of you may have participated in such studies. People are trying to figure this out, okay? But it's simply not the case, based on what we know at present, that we can say that scores on an IAT are measures of prejudice to begin with, much less unconscious prejudice. Even if the IAT measures prejudice, it might be prejudice that a person is not willing to reveal, which is not the same as prejudice that the person doesn't know about. So again, there are all sorts of issues here about making the distinction between conscious and unconscious mental life. Unconscious memory, unconscious perception, they are very well established in the literature. Unconscious perception is well established, and one of the other things that's well established about it is those effects are very weak. Unconscious learning, unconscious thinking, less well established. Unconscious motivation, unconscious emotion, also less well established. The jury's still out. Research is ongoing. Stay tuned for further results. Okay, let's just bring it to a close here. Remember, next Monday we're going to do a kind of in-class Q&A session, but also post those questions to the discussion board on B courses. You'll get a response from me very quickly, and we'll do the midterm exam on Wednesday. Thank you very much.